I'm Christian Chiller, and in this video, I'm going to look at two new plugins from JetBrains for their Intellij IDEs that help writers. JetBrains are generally known for their developer tools, their IDEs, their integrated developer environments, not so much for writing. Well, these plugins are aimed at technical writers who often work alongside programmers, especially in the new world of docs as code, which is a methodology where writers follow very similar workflows and practices to developers. So Git, markup languages, etc., etc. So recently, JetBrains developed two plugins to help with that process for their tools. These plugins are Writerside, which is aimed at building, testing, previewing documentation sets, and Grazie, which comes in two flavors, Grazie and Grazie Professional, and I will dig into what that means a little later, but that is a writing assistant for grammar, spelling, style, and even text completion. Many who follow my videos and my blogs know that I am typically a VS Code user with a handful of plugins that do some similar things. So JetBrains asked me to take a look at these and see what I thought in comparison to my setup. And in this video, I take them for a spin and see how they compare and see if I will change. Let's get started. First, let's start with Writerside. Writerside is there to help you build, test, and preview documentation sets. It supports two types of markup, vanilla markdown, whatever that may mean, and JetBrains' own custom semantic markup language, which is, to be fair, a fair bit like Markdown. Whichever one you choose, you have numerous features available to you like content reuse, single sourcing, variables, templates, creating topics, logic, and many other things, and you get these whether you use Markdown or the custom markup language. So beginning with Writerside, the Writerside plugin is in early access. You have to go to the plugin page, download it manually, and then install from the cog here, install plugins from disk. So make sure you have an up-to-date version. It has its own project type that you can create from new project. You'll now see a new entry for Writerside, and I'll give it a name. You can see some other options here, and not many to choose from. Create it. On creation, it creates this basic structure. I'm going to go through what all of this means, but this may look a little different from what some of you are used to. And this is time to maybe go through a quick explanation of the two main different ways of doing documentation. So one, which is the quote-unquote newer way, is docs as code, which I've been referring to so far. This is where you create documentation generally as a loose collection of markup files in folders, organized typically by another tool, so creating a menu, but quite often following kind of a folder structure. It's quite loose, it's quite unstructured, and you generally write the content as a kind of beginning to end guide as how to do something. But there is another method, which is not a method I've used a massive amount. It's the more long established method, which is called topic-based. And this is very popular, especially in enterprise level software or non-software projects where the documentation has multiple outputs. So web page, printed manuals in the past maybe, or a PDF, or in-application help. And using the topic-based methodology lets you kind of reproduce content in different ways. So it could be that certain topics are needed for one output, but not for another, etc., etc. And what Writerside is doing here is organizing things by default in that kind of way. So it looks a little different to what you may be used to begin with. But let's expand this and have a quick look through what is here by default. This isn't by all means everything that Writerside might create as it goes, but let's look at the basics. So we have a project file here. This is XML based. JetBrains tools are largely from a Java world, and I think are still written in Java or Kotlin, and XML and XML type documents are kind of their bread and butter, shall we say, the standard sorts of things you tend to see in configuration and project configuration files. So the project.ihp lists places where things are, and many of these could be configured in the settings in the GUI as well. The topics folder, as just discussed, and we can open up this file, and this is getting into some of the custom syntax, which we'll come back to in a minute. Images, I think that makes reasonable sense. C.list is a list of categories, also XML. sp.tree is the table of contents. Knows the order and structure, again, HTML based. And vlist is another XML file of variables. But as I say, there may be other files that will get added here, and as they get added, I will go through what they are. This is just the project view. This is not particularly unique to Writerside. You'll actually notice there's a second tab here that says Writerside, and we can now see here kind of how Writerside organizes things internally. Let's start with this bottom pane, which is how we add topics, which is the bulk of the content you'll want to create here. So we can add either a markdown or an SML topic. So this is the semantic markup language, as it's called, and topic from a template. We haven't created any yet. Let's go with markdown for now. And of course we give it a name. Good old-fashioned hello world seems appropriate. This doesn't look anything particularly different so far. Of course, it just looks like a markdown file. But here we can also duplicate it, copy the topic, preview it, edit it, set it as a starting page, or create a template from it. So now you'll see we have a series of custom templates down here, in addition to a whole bunch created by default. So maybe we will open up one of these just to have a little bit more content there, so I don't have to create it from scratch. And again, this doesn't look that different. We can see some custom syntax here, and I will cover what all of these mean in a moment. Let's have a look at one of the SML ones. So for example, a how-to document. And this is where things are interesting because it's mostly this custom XML tags and HTML, which is where things get a little sort of confusing, potentially, because it's mixed syntax, not as clean as Markdown, as it were. That said, if you start typing, you do see a list of what is possible. And some of these things, this is semantic markup that you may not be familiar with. I'm not massively familiar with it. I remember it from my days of XHTML, back in the early days of HTML version 3. You can see some things here. For example, etc. This is all semantic. And then the semantics are rendered in different ways. Some of this is also available inside the Markdown, but let's come back to how the different language features kind of interplay with each other in a moment. Switching back to the semantic one for now, there are also properties on many of these. As you can see here, things like filter ID instance, switcher, key, title. The chapters have their own as well. Collapsible, for example, this will all, in the default kind of way that Writerside will render things, determine how it's going to look. You can hazard a guess at what collapsible means. And there's many others actually available depending on the semantic entity type. And in the documentation, you can find an entire sort of summary of what these mean. So things like procedure always has a child elements that are steps, for example, and they will render in a particular way. Tips, notes, and warnings. I think you're probably familiar with those from other tools. They're called admonitions quite often in the kind of Markdown-based world of tools, and etc., etc. Markdown predominantly supports just the common mark specification with FlexMark as a processor. but has a few additional things. And you can use IntelliJ's default Markdown plugin to, on the insert here, get extra options like images, tables, etc. For example, Markdown tables are great fun, and I've just already broken that table. You can also drag and drop things onto here. You can use standard Markdown formatting, of course, etc., etc. There are some additional features available in the Markdown here. Let's get another file in. So for the code, for example, you can actually add additional attributes, which you usually do by adding these curly braces. Not everything has them. So for example, code blocks has collapsible features, also default state, disable links, and line numbers, symbols, a few others, prompt symbols you can also add. And of course, how all these look depends on the rendering. And again, you can find all of this in the writer-side documentation. One really cool one, if IntelliJ supports the language, you can also do validation. So you can test the code like this. I'm interested to see how that works, actually. I mean, this isn't going to do a great deal in this particular case, but there's quite a lot of cool things there. If that wasn't cool enough, and it's already pretty useful feature there, there's one other thing we can do, and that is single sourcing code blocks. So actually pulling in live code instead of putting it in these Markdown fence blocks. We need to go and make a couple of small changes first. We'll create a snippets folder. Let's create a file. And inside the project, set a folder. And now we can switch back. And here we can now instead, I mean, this is obviously duplicating here, include the source file from that location instead, which is also quite useful because then you can test the code externally. Images are much the same as you'd expect in normal Markdown, but again, there are attributes that we can add, things like width, a border effect, a style, preview source, thumbnail, etc., etc. And you can also pull in images from elsewhere and just use them as a reference from another topic, for example. Links, I don't have any links here, but one of the things you can do with links is specify if it's going to be an internal or an external link, and that changes how it looks, or also a reference style. And this just means the links go at the bottom. This is actually standard Markdown, but it's not something a lot of people always use, to be honest with you. You can equally have tips, notes, and warnings. And you do this by putting in actually what is typically a quote. If you have nothing, it's just a tip. If you, again, use the curly brackets with style, you can change it manually as well. And it will render in gray, green, and red, depending on which type you pick. Let's go for all of the time we're doing this. It might be helpful to see how things look. And there is actually a preview here. I have an image error. That's fine. Yeah, you can see so everything that we've done so far here. There is a bit more. You can also do definitions, lists, and you can see those. We've gone past them elsewhere in this document here. So this kind of thing. It's basically just another rendering issue. But of course, if you open up some curly brackets underneath, there are attributes you can add. There's a couple of different ways you can do content reuse in writer-side, but It's kind of the one that interests me the most, is usually reusing bits of content inside other bits of content. And the way you do this is, let's find something suitable. So this here is good. This is a markdown file, so the syntax varies ever so slightly in each case, but you pretty much go underneath the item, add an attribute. So we'll do this generic intro, for example, save it. You can also do it this way if you want to have kind of a larger multiple element, as it were, because this is a paragraph and a list. And I cannot type like that, for example. So we have those two items there. So this is the two ways you can do it. Let's remember they're both inside the tutorial file. We have ID generic intro and ID prerequisites, just done in two different ways. So we come down here and do include from. It is the tutorial file and element ID, and then they actually show up. And you can see paragraph and snippet. Let's close that off, and then we can do the other one. Yeah, and that took a second, but it showed up. And then we can do the other one again, tutorial, element ID, prerequisites, close the tag. And yeah, it looks not rendered quite right, but I think that might be the actual source markdown that wasn't quite right. And we can possibly fix the syntax there. And there we go. Now it's actually there. So the syntax is a little bit wrong in the source file. There's actually a whole bunch of other ways you can do reusable content as well, but let's leave that there, and you can go off and investigate those yourself. Another thing you can do is variables. So this is things like company names, model numbers, release versions, this kind of thing that you want to just write in one place, and then as it's rendered, it's updated. This we go into the project folder, the v.list, and you can see there's one here already. We have to define it. Name, let's call it release. Value is currently 1, and we'll make it a type is a string, and then close it. And to use it, we then go back into a file and percentage signs. And there it is. So far, so good. There's quite a lot of cool features there. How do we now deliver that to the world? And this is where things get interesting. You pretty much have to do it writer's side IntelliJ's way, which pretty much means exporting it to HTML in a zip file. This is fine, but in certain instances that's a little limiting, and you may have to rework a lot of your tool chains to reflect that if you're already using other tools to serve your documentation. But it is just HTML, so it's pretty flexible, but you have to be prepared to switch that tool chain. To create a build for deployment, the easiest way is you right-click on the project, and you get a zip file of all the HTML. As there are a series of configuration files here, you actually need to serve this. So here I'm using a tool to serve it locally. I can open up the preview address, and there is the documentation project as expected. There are some other options available, like deploying to GitHub, to TeamCity, to GitLab, and also actions or automated processes for all of those platforms, and probably more coming soon as well. Next, I will look at Grazie. This comes in two varieties, which is why I'm doing it second, because it's a little more complicated. The default version actually comes bundled with all IntelliJ-based IDEs, so you might have been using it without realizing. It supports over 20 languages and text in full text files like Markdown or restructured text, as well as comments in numerous programming languages. And it uses Language Tool, which is a fairly well-known writing assistant that ships with dozens, if not hundreds, of inbuilt rules for checking grammar and spelling and style in, again, many different languages. As you have it installed already, then why not give it a go? Grazie Professional sits on top of Grazie and also comes in two flavors. I told you this gets a little bit more complicated. Firstly, it also supports checking against various industry standard style guides like the Google and Microsoft Style Guide. You can do this using Grazie's own checking mechanisms, or you can use Veil, which is another open source tool, which, disclaimer, I contribute to, and you can use it in addition to or instead of using Grazie to check against those styles. Veil also lets you create and customize your own style sheets, which is off topic for this video, but if you use it, you know it, and you will find that quite useful. It also has many other features besides this, including natural language completion, syntactic transformations, which I find quite hard to say, parts of speech highlighting, which you might have seen where you can see adverbs, nouns, parts of speech, things like that you might use, rephrasing and synonization, definitions, and translations. Now, this is where things also split again. Those last three are only available if you connect to JetBrains cloud offering. All the others work locally, and the cloud offering is currently in a private beta stage. But guess what? I had an invite, so all these features, there's a lot of them. Let's dive in and take a look about how they work and how they can be useful to you. Grazie is what JetBrains calls an intelligent spelling and grammar checker for any text. So this is markup languages like Markdown, but also code comments. If you want to take a little look at what's going on, open up the IDE preferences under Editor, Natural Language, Grammar and Style, and Spelling. So you can see spelling is the easiest. You can have application level and project level dictionaries. This can be useful. It is using Hunspell and lists of plain text words. And you can see you can also add accepted words here for custom brands and things like that. And you can see you can also set where to save those exceptions. The grammar and style option pulls a series of rules from Language Tool, which is a fairly well-known language checker. Let's just call it that for now. I think it's changing what it calls itself as well. So, and you can see what's enabled here, what's disabled or what's partially enabled, indicated by the dash. So you can see lots of grammar rules here, and examples on each one if you click them. I like some of these. As a British Australian, I interchangeably use eggplant and aubergine all the time. And many others here. You can't really customize any of them, but you get the idea. You can also see the scope of what it will check and then exceptions. I haven't added any yet. This is similar to the spelling exception, pretty much. So I added a little bit more text here as a good example to mess around with. It's a little bit hard sometimes to see this underlines. I think you can change these in the Intellij IDE settings. So you can see them inline and the top suggestion or more options. There's not really any more options in this particular case, apart from adding it to the dictionary, which we just looked at. You can also see all the problems by opening up the problems pane here. So let's start fixing some of these if we agree with them. So we'll do that one. What else have we got? I enabled a few extra rules in the settings, e.g. without a comma in this case. I don't know why it says it multiple times, but there you go. So we can replace with, for example, or yeah, we can ignore it, we can replace it, or we can add a comma, which is the actual rule. There we go. This is incorrect. Keep wanting to look at more actions just out of interest. So we can ignore it, configure the rule, or just change it. So that was not necessarily a spelling error, it was a grammatical error. What else have we got? So this is saying convert to smart quotes. This is actually something I would probably disable. I don't agree with that in technical copy, but there we go. And I think similar here. Sometimes getting it to show up. There we go. Typographical apostrophe instead. Now, this is an interesting one because this is a strange word. This is a company name that is N, 8N. So N is actually correct in this case. So we could do ignore. And some other words here that are correct, but technical terms, etc., etc. So you get the idea of what's possible there. Spelling errors plus some other basic style things that you can configure to a certain degree. And you can find also a lot more about them on the Language Tool website, actually. Grazie Professional is an additional plugin that you enable alongside normal Grazie. And as mentioned earlier, it comes in two flavors: local, where all processing happens locally on your machine, and cloud, where it's a mixture between local and the cloud service. I will point out which features are which, or which features are enhanced by using the cloud service. And there's a lot to it, so let's get stuck in. You'll find its settings in a couple of different places. Firstly, for overall Grazie Professional configuration, in the Settings, Editor, Natural Languages, Grazie Professional, with a few options here, the local or cloud, when to show text completion, and whether to enable veil. And if you do, then the path to the veil binary. It also adds things into the grammar and style rules here, and also adds quite a bit inside the editor inspections proofreading section here as well. You'll see, because we've already enabled veil, it's looking for a veil config file. It should respect the rules that veil follows, which is if it looks for a config file and it can't find one, it goes up a level, up a level, up a level to the home folder. Well, let's create one in here anyway. This is, of course, now having a problem because I need a path, which I don't have. But Veil does have some features to handle that, which IntelliJ wraps. So now it's set up, even though we haven't really added much here, apart from the internal Veil rules. Now we can come back to our document, and we see some different things now. You could still see some of the problems in line, and we're starting to see new problems. We can click problems as well here, and we can now see the difference between the language tool provided issues found and the Veil issues found. And there will be some conflicts here. And you can also see them floating up here. 3 errors, 13 text issues, 6 style issues. So let's go through some of these. I can almost guarantee this is going to be a Veil issue. I did mention earlier that the Veil integration is kind of read-only. So it tells us there's a problem, doesn't offer anything to resolve it. Because I actually build the Veil extension for VS Code, I sort of know how to fix this, but it is up to the implementer of the plugin, i.e. JetBrains in this case, to do that. And it'll be similar for this one here, although we're also getting this as something that the language tool recognizes. This is not correct. We do actually want EKSCTL, but now we're seeing different options as well, although these are not really going to work right now. This is more for grammar changes, so let's find one of those. So in this case, we now see a more grammatical error that potentially Grazie can help with. Resource should probably be singular or possessive in a compound noun. And this one is a little bit of a gray area, but let's follow what Grazie suggests. So we can hover here for more actions. You can see some basic suggestions here, including configuring the rule, or some options here to rephrase, and it gives some options that are not completely accurate, but there we go. Or we can hover again and see show word definitions. In this case, I think most people would understand what resources are, but maybe we don't, and we'd like a little bit of help with it to know how to word it better. And then also translation. So this is translating the entire sentence, we could say, to German. Yeah. But I think for now, we'll go with, I think this is probably correct because the values is plural there. So you start to see that Grazie Professional offers some other options. To be fair, this document is fairly well written, so it's not going to find too many, hopefully. And here's another example. This is saying similar problem as before, actually. So we could have either that resource isn't, those resources aren't, and maybe rephrasing again. What's that going to offer as an option? Okay, yeah, this is offering more different options. This is all coming from the cloud. And in this case, we could see more options. In some respects, I kind of like this option. So this is where these tools become interesting because it offers you alternatives maybe you hadn't thought about. All right, anything else? I mean, this is so well written, you're not going to find that many problems. Let's see. Here's another one, a plural instead of a singular. I'm interested to try this rephrase again. Yeah, this is interesting because this is correct. This is a different meaning of default. I think in this case, the singular is actually just the better option there, etc., etc. You get the idea in this case. The text completion is another interesting idea. I'm yet to prove whether it gets better over time as it builds up more of a kind of knowledge based on your documentation set. But maybe from here we have enough context already. Both of these documents, so the majority of the text in this example project are about a particular product, about using Kubernetes, about using cloud hosting, that kind of thing. So maybe we'll try. And you can see it took a little bit of time, a few words, but also a little bit of time to return a response. I guess it depends a little there. And now this is reasonable. If I only want to accept the next word, I hit tab. If, on the other hand, I want to try and finish more than one word at a time, firstly, you have to change the settings under editor, natural languages, Grazie Professional. We have to change this to in a pop-up. And now still has that same sort of little bit of waiting. So now we can see it in a pop-up. If we hit tab again, we would do one word at a time, or we can hit enter to get the entire suggestion. When it comes to style guides as opposed to grammatical checks, Grazie Professional has a number of industry standard spell checkers built in. Now you'll find them under style. And you can see here the Google one, the Microsoft one, also Alex for insensitive writing. And we can also add Veil custom ones. I'm not going to go into the details of how to do that because I feel like that's an entire video in itself that I should make and have written about. But let's have a look at these. It's probably easier to try and trigger Alex, unfortunately. So we can see this has been highlighted. So this is it's actually coming from the Google style guide, but it could equally come from the Alex style guide. You can see workers instead of workmen. I don't know if rephrasing would offer an alternative. Some different ones, some better than others, but actually this is basically the same. But let's cancel that and go with the default one. So that's pulling in directly from that style guide. Although interestingly, this rule is contradicting itself. But that is a Google style guide issue, I think. I mean, in theory, we can, in this particular case, just doing the plural is fine, actually. And if you're interested in finding out how to configure those custom Veil styles in Grazie itself, because it does it slightly differently from vanilla Veil, then I've got a link to the details on screen right now. Another feature, one that is always popular with a lot of technical writers, is rephrasing, syntactic transformation. So for example, passive voice to active voice. So let's get an example here. So here, this is passive voice. In many cases, though, for a lot of writers who aren't experienced, they don't really know what they're supposed to do. This is a relatively easy example, but you need to make the actor and the subject more obvious. So in this case, Grazie helps here. So it doesn't just say this is a problem, it will actually tell you how to fix it. So it could convert there. It converts the passive to the active. Another case is expanding contractions. So we could have, for example, this, IDE, and we can say expand contraction form into a full one. And we can set whether just here or everywhere in this document. I doubt it's anywhere else in the document, so we'll just do it just here, and we get I would instead. There are also other syntactic transformations that Grazie Professional supports, but that is probably some of the common ones. I already enabled the parts of speech highlighting, and we can see the coloring here, but if we're only interested in knowing particular ones, we can also right-click anywhere and turn things on or off. So I'm not so interested in knowing about conjunctions, for example, or nouns, and they are now in black, although it's possibly slightly hard to tell in the screen render, but you did see a slight change in color there. And of course, if this is a little too hard to see, you can go again, right-click, edit the color settings to change what those colors might be. So that was obviously just some of the features of Grazie and Writerside. And Grazie Pro and Writerside are both in active development, so we'll have more features by the time I have finished this video and by the time you watch it. So there's going to be many more changes that I may not have covered. But the question remains, would I use them plus any Intellij IDE instead of VS Code and my current tools? I'm not sure. I have got kind of used to VS Code, and in many ways, whilst neither of them have particularly OS native interfaces, VS Code feels slightly more native. I don't know why. And I think the main one for me is that quite often I'm building documentation for various different tools. Jekyll, Docusaurus, MKDocs, Hugo, these sorts of things. And I like the flexibility of the tool chains I can have. Of course, the quality of the extensions that are connected to those in VS Code can vary, but they're there. Whereas my main issue with Writerside is you have to build in its way. I do know that the team are thinking about how they could support that flexibility and kind of a plugin architecture to the plugin itself, but so far that hasn't been done. So who knows? I think I will keep them around and definitely keep testing. Some of that integrated checking is very good. And whilst, again, there are some options in VS Code, so Veil, language tool, and even an API fed version of Grammarly, they're all sort of disparate from each other. Well, they're not disparate, but they're not part of the same suite, whereas with Grazie, they're part of the same suite. And again, some of that single sourcing aspect in Writerside is quite cool. So if I could use that plus output it to one of the tools that I want to use, that would be fantastic, and I would probably switch almost immediately. That said, if they interested you, then take a look at the links below to download them, to get enrolled in the early access programs, and let me know your feelings and your feedback in the comments below. I have been Christian Schiller. This has been Writing with Intellij, and thank you very much for joining me.